They called her the Black Widow of the Midwest, though that name came only after the bodies started appearing. Before that April day in 1908, when flames consumed her farmhouse, Belle Gunness was simply a hard-working Norwegian immigrant who had built a prosperous farm from nothing. She was a woman who had suffered tremendous losses, who had buried 2 husbands and struggled to raise her children alone. At least, that's what everyone believed. The truth was far more sinister, and it would take investigators years to piece together the full extent of her crimes that may have claimed over 40 victims. The story of Belle Gunness begins not in the killing fields of Indiana, but in the small fishing village of Selbu, Norway, where she was born Brynhild Paulsdatter Størset on November 11th, 1859. The Norway of Belle's childhood was a harsh place, especially for the 8th child in a poor family struggling to survive on a small farm. Food was scarce, winters were brutal, and opportunities were nearly non-existent. Like millions of other Europeans in the late 1800s, young Brynhild looked across the Atlantic Ocean and saw America as a land of infinite possibility, a place where someone like her could reinvent themselves completely. In 1881, at the age of 21, she boarded a ship bound for America, leaving behind everything she had ever known. She arrived in New York with little more than the clothes on her back and a fierce determination to succeed. She made her way to Chicago, where a thriving Norwegian immigrant community had established itself, and she quickly found work as a domestic servant. It was there that she shed her old name, like an uncomfortable dress, adopting the more American-sounding Belle, and beginning the transformation that would define the rest of her life. Chicago in the 1880s was a city of extraordinary contrasts. Magnificent mansions lined the lakefront, while immigrant families crowded into tenements that lacked basic sanitation. The smell of the stockyards permeated everything, a constant reminder of the brutal nature of survival in industrial America. For Belle, working in the homes of wealthy families, the disparity between rich and poor must have been particularly striking. She watched how the wealthy lived, how they carried themselves, how they spoke. She was learning, always learning, filing away information that she would later use in ways no one could have imagined. In 1884, Belle married Mads Sorensen, a fellow Norwegian immigrant who worked as a watchman. They seemed like a typical immigrant couple, working hard to establish themselves in their new country. They moved to the Austin neighborhood of Chicago and opened a small confectionery store. To their neighbors, they appeared to be living the American dream, building a business and starting a family. Belle gave birth to 4 children, Caroline, Axel, Myrtle, and Lucy. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, strange things were beginning to happen. The confectionery store burned down within a year of opening. Belle collected the insurance money. Then their home burned down. Again, Belle collected the insurance money. A pattern was emerging, though no one seemed to notice at the time. Insurance companies were less sophisticated in their investigations back then, and fires were common enough in a city still rebuilding from the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Belle learned a valuable lesson from these early incidents. Disaster could be profitable if you knew how to work the system, but it wasn't just property that seemed to attract misfortune around Belle. 2 of the children, Caroline and Axel, died in infancy. The official cause of death was listed as acute colitis, a catch-all diagnosis that covered various forms of gastrointestinal distress. The symptoms, severe stomach pain, vomiting, convulsions, were consistent with several conditions common in children at the time. They were also consistent with poisoning, though no one thought to investigate further. After all, infant mortality was tragically common in the late 1800s, and Belle played the grieving mother perfectly. Then came July 30th, 1900, a date that would prove pivotal in Belle's evolution from insurance fraudster to something far more sinister. Mads Sorensen died suddenly at their home. The timing was curious. July 30th was the one day when two of Mad's life insurance policies overlapped, meaning Belle would collect on both. The doctor who examined Mad's noted symptoms consistent with strychnine poisoning, but Belle insisted her husband had been feeling unwell and had taken some powder for his condition. Without an autopsy, there was no way to prove otherwise. Belle collected $8,500 in insurance money, a fortune at the time, equivalent to roughly $300,000 today. With her newfound wealth, Belle decided it was time for a fresh start. She packed up her surviving daughters, Myrtle and Lucy, along with Jenny Olson, a foster daughter she had taken in, and left Chicago for LaPorte, Indiana. LaPorte was a small but prosperous town about 60 miles east of Chicago, close enough to the city for business, but far enough away that Belle could reinvent herself once again. She purchased a farm on the outskirts of town, a 48-acre property with a large brick house, several outbuildings, and plenty of privacy. The farm was perfect for Belle's purposes, though what those purposes were would only become clear years later. The property was isolated enough that visitors could come and go without attracting attention, yet close enough to town that Belle could maintain a respectable presence in the community. She joined the local Norwegian Lutheran church, where she was known for her generous contributions and her beautiful singing voice. She enrolled her daughters in school and made sure they were always well-dressed and well-mannered. To all appearances, she was a model citizen, a hard-working widow doing her best to provide for her family. In April 1902, Belle married again, this time to Peter Gunness, a fellow Norwegian widower with two daughters of his own. Peter was a kind, gentle man who had worked as a butcher and seemed genuinely devoted to making a new family with Belle. But the marriage would be tragically short-lived. Just 8 months after the wedding, Peter Gunness died in what Belle described as a terrible accident. According to Belle's version of events, she was in the kitchen making dinner when she heard a crash. She rushed to find Peter lying on the floor, his skull crushed by a heavy sausage grinder that had fallen from a high shelf. "It was a tragic accident," she said, sobbing as she told the story to anyone who would listen. Peter's skull had been crushed so severely that his brain was visible through the wound. Some people found it odd that a sausage grinder could cause such catastrophic damage, and others wondered why it had been on such a high shelf in the first place. But Belle was so distraught, so convincing in her grief, that these questions were quickly dismissed. Jenny Olson, Belle's foster daughter, would later tell classmates a different story. She said she had been in the kitchen when it happened, and that Belle had deliberately struck Peter with the grinder while he sat at the table. But Jenny was just a child, and children were known to have active imaginations. Besides, who would believe that a respectable widow would murder her husband in cold blood? The coroner ruled Peter's death an accident, and Belle collected another insurance payout. Now twice widowed, Belle found herself in an interesting position. She owned a substantial farm, had money in the bank, and had proven herself capable of running a business. But she also had children to feed and a farm to maintain. She needed help, and she needed money. It was then that Belle hit upon the scheme that would ultimately lead to her downfall, but not before claiming dozens of victims. Belle began placing advertisements in Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest. These ads, which would become infamous, typically read something like this: "Personal, comely widow who owns a large farm in one of the finest districts in LaPorte County, Indiana, desires to make the acquaintance of a gentleman equally well provided, with view of joining fortunes. No replies by letter considered unless sender is willing to follow answer with personal visit. Triflers need not apply." The ads were carefully crafted to appeal to lonely Norwegian bachelors who had come to America seeking fortune but had found only hard work and isolation. Belle presented herself as the solution to all their problems, a prosperous widow with property who was looking for companionship and perhaps marriage. She understood her targets perfectly. These were men who had left everything behind to come to America, who had no close family ties, who had saved their money carefully over years of labor. They were perfect victims. The first men began arriving at the farm in 1902, shortly after Peter's death. They came from Wisconsin, Minnesota, South Dakota, Iowa, anywhere the Norwegian newspapers circulated. They arrived with their life savings, ready to start a new life with the charming widow who had captured their hearts through letters. Belle would welcome them warmly, showing them around the farm, introducing them to her children, making them feel like they had finally found a home. John Moe came from Minnesota with $1,000. He was last seen going for a walk with Belle around the farm. She later told people he had gone to Norway to visit family. Old Budsberg came from Wisconsin with $2,000. He disappeared after a few days at the farm. Belle said he had decided the arrangement wasn't for him and had left for Oregon. Andrew Helgelien arrived from South Dakota with $2,900. He vanished as well, though Belle kept writing to his relatives in Norway, signing his name, assuring them he was well and happy. The pattern was always the same. The men would arrive with their money, which Belle would convince them to either give to her for safekeeping or deposit in her bank account as a show of good faith for their impending marriage. Then, usually within days or weeks, they would disappear. Belle always had an explanation. They had gone back to Norway. They had found work in another state. They had decided farm life wasn't for them. And who was going to question her? These men were loners, drifters, immigrants with no close connections. It would be months or even years before anyone realized they were missing. But Belle wasn't just luring men to the farm. She was also buying life insurance policies on them, forging their signatures, and then collecting when they died. She had learned from her experiences with her husbands that insurance companies rarely questioned a grieving widow, especially one as respectable and well known in the community as Belle Gunness. She had also learned that bodies didn't need to be found for insurance to pay out. A simple declaration of death after a suitable period was often enough. The farm itself became a carefully orchestrated killing ground. Belle had built a special room in the basement, which she kept locked at all times. She told her children it was for storing preserves and meat, but the truth was far more sinister. She had also invested in a large furnace, supposedly for heating the house, but which burned hot enough to dispose of evidence. The pig pen, which covered several acres of the property, provided another convenient disposal site. Pigs, as Belle well knew from her farm upbringing, would eat almost anything, including human remains. Jenny Olsen, Belle's foster daughter, was becoming a problem. Now 16 years old, Jenny had seen too much and was starting to ask questions. She had been in the house when several of the men disappeared, and she had noticed things, bloodstains that Belle quickly cleaned up, strange smells coming from the basement, the sound of digging in the yard at night. In the fall of 1906, Belle told everyone that she was sending Jenny to a finishing school in California. Jenny packed her bags, said goodbye to her friends, and was never seen again. Belle later claimed that Jenny had decided to stay in California and had stopped writing. But Jenny's friends found it strange that she would cut off all contact so suddenly, especially since she had been so excited about her upcoming graduation from high school. As the years went on, Belle became bolder and more ruthless. She was no longer content to wait for victims to come to her. She began actively cultivating multiple relationships simultaneously, writing to several men at once, playing them against each other, extracting money through promises and manipulation before they even arrived at the farm. She had become an expert at reading people, at understanding their desires and weaknesses, at telling them exactly what they wanted to hear. One of her regular correspondents was Andrew Helgelien, the man from South Dakota who had arrived with nearly $3,000. Unlike the others, Andrew had a brother, Asl, who was concerned when Andrew's letters suddenly stopped coming. Belle tried to maintain the charade, writing letters in Andrew's name, but Asle noticed that the handwriting was different and the writing style didn't sound like his brother. He became increasingly suspicious and threatened to come to Laporte to investigate. It was around this time that Belle began corresponding with Ray Lamphere, a local farmhand who would become intricately linked to the final chapter of her story. Ray was different from her other victims. He was local, poor, and genuinely infatuated. With Belle, she hired him to do odd jobs around the farm, and for a time they were lovers. But Ray was jealous and possessive, and he didn't like seeing the parade of men coming to visit Belle. He began drinking heavily and making scenes in town, declaring that he knew things about Belle that would shock everyone. Belle realized that Ray was becoming a liability. She fired him and took out a restraining order against him, claiming he had threatened her and her children. She went to the authorities multiple times, building a case that Ray was dangerous and unstable. She was setting him up, creating a narrative that would serve her purposes when the time came. Because Belle knew that time was running out, Asle Helgelien was getting more insistent about his brother's whereabouts, and there were others asking questions too. The walls were closing in, and Belle needed an exit strategy. In early 1908, Belle began making preparations. She had her will drawn up, leaving everything to her children. She increased her life insurance policies. She told people that she was afraid for her life, that Ray Lamphere had threatened to burn down her house and kill her and her children. She was setting the stage for her final act. Though no one realized it at the time, she also placed one more advertisement, this one attracting the attention of George Anderson, a Missouri farmer who arrived at the farm in April 1908. But George was different from the others. He was cautious, suspicious even. When Belle suggested he go to the bank and withdraw his money to prove his serious intentions, he declined. When she became insistent, he grew even more suspicious. On the night of April 27, 1908, George woke to find Belle standing over his bed, her face illuminated by moonlight, holding a candle in one hand. Something about her expression terrified him. He jumped up, packed his bags, and left immediately. Despite Belle's protests, he would later say that he was certain she had been planning to kill him that night. George Anderson's departure seemed to trigger something in Belle. She knew he would talk, that he would tell people about his strange experience at the farm. Combined with Asle Helgelien's persistent inquiries and Ray Lamphere's drunken threats, Belle must have realized that her time in Laporte was coming to an end. She had one last card to play, one final deception that would be her most audacious. Yet on April 28, 1908, Belle went to her lawyer and had her will witnessed. She seemed agitated, nervous. She told him that she was certain Ray Lamphere was going to kill her, that she had seen him lurking around the farm. The lawyer tried to reassure her, but Belle was insistent. She said she had a premonition that something terrible was going to happen. The lawyer would later remember being struck by her demeanor. She seemed genuinely frightened, but there was something else in her eyes, something he couldn't quite identify. That same day, Belle hired a new handyman, Joe Maxson, giving him very specific instructions. He was to sleep in the house that night, but in a room on the second floor, far from the family's bedrooms. She said it was for protection against Ray Lamphere, but Joe found the arrangement odd. Why would she want him so far away if she was really afraid for her safety? The early morning hours of April 28, 1908, were cool and quiet in Laporte. Joe Maxson was awakened around 4 a.m. by the smell of smoke. He opened his door to find the hallway filled with thick, black smoke. The house was on fire. Joe tried to reach the family's bedrooms, but the smoke was too thick, the heat too intense. He barely managed to escape through a window, breaking his ankle in the fall. By the time he raised the alarm and neighbors arrived, the house was fully engulfed in flames. The fire burned with an unusual intensity, so hot that it melted metal fixtures and reduced furniture to ash. Neighbors who arrived to help noticed that the fire seemed to be burning from multiple points of origin, as if it had been deliberately set in several places at once. But their immediate concern was for Belle and the children. Despite the danger, several men tried to enter the house, but the heat drove them back. All they could do was watch as the farmhouse collapsed in on itself, taking any hope of rescue with it. As dawn broke and the fire finally began to die down, searchers began the grim task of looking for bodies. In what had been the basement, they found 4 corpses, 3 children and an adult. The children were quickly identified as Myrtle, Lucy, and Philip, Belle's son, with Peter Gunness. But the adult body presented a puzzle. It was clearly a woman, but the head was missing, apparently severed before the fire. More mysteriously, the body seemed too small to be Belle. Belle was a large woman, nearly 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds. This body appeared to be of a much smaller woman, perhaps 150 pounds at most. The authorities were initially confused. If this wasn't Belle, where was she? And who was this woman? As they continued to search the ruins, they found no trace of Belle's head, though they did find her dental bridge with several gold teeth near the bodies. This seemed to confirm that Belle had died in the fire, but doubts persisted. The body was simply too small, and the missing head was deeply suspicious. Ray Lamphere was arrested the same day, charged with arson and murder. He had been seen near the farm the night of the fire, and given Belle's numerous complaints about him, he seemed the obvious suspect. But Ray insisted he was innocent of murder. He admitted to being at the farm, even admitted to starting the fire. But he swore that Belle and the children were already dead when he set the blaze. No one believed him at first. It seemed like exactly the kind of thing a guilty man would say. But then Asle Helgelian arrived in La Porte, still searching for his brother Andrew. He convinced the sheriff to search the farm more thoroughly. On May 3rd, 1908, they began digging in the soft soil near the pig pen. What they found would shock the nation and reveal the true extent of Belle's crimes. The first body they found was Andrew Helgelian's, wrapped in oilcloth and buried in a shallow grave. His skull had been crushed, and his body showed signs of dismemberment, but Andrew was just the beginning. As they continued to dig, they found more bodies, so many that they lost count. Men, women, even children, all buried in the soft earth around the farm. Some had been dismembered, their bodies cut apart with surgical precision. Others showed signs of poisoning. Many were so decomposed that identification was impossible. Among the bodies was one that was almost certainly Jenny Olsen, Belle's foster daughter, who had supposedly gone to California. There were also the bodies of 2 unidentified women, one of whom might have been the headless corpse found in the fire. The theory that emerged was that Belle had killed another woman, dressed her in Belle's clothes, and placed her in the basement with the children before setting the fire and escaping. As news of the discoveries spread, people began coming forward, with stories about missing relatives who had gone to visit a widow in La Porte. The bodies kept coming, from the basement, from the yard, from the pig pen. Conservative estimates put the number at 14, but some investigators believed there were over 40 victims. Many bodies were never found, likely disposed of in the furnace or fed to the pigs. The investigation revealed the full scope of Belle's operation. She had been killing for years, possibly decades. She had murdered for money, for convenience, and perhaps simply because she could. She had killed husbands, suitors, children, anyone who got in her way or had something she wanted. She had turned murder into a business, a carefully orchestrated enterprise that had netted her thousands of dollars. But where was Belle? Despite extensive searches, she was never found. There were sightings of her across the country, in Chicago, in New York, in San Francisco. A woman matching her description was seen boarding a ship to Europe. Another was spotted in Mississippi, but none of these leads panned out. Belle Gunness had vanished as completely as her victims once had. Ray Lamphere's trial began in November 1908, and it was a sensation. The courthouse was packed every day with people eager to hear the gruesome details of Belle's crimes. Ray maintained his innocence of murder throughout, and his lawyer argued that Belle had killed the children herself and faked her own death. The prosecution argued that Ray had killed them all in a fit of jealous rage. During the trial, a woman named Elizabeth Smith came forward with a shocking story. She said that Belle had approached her weeks before the fire, asking if she wanted to make some easy money. Belle had allegedly offered to pay Elizabeth to help her with some work at the farm. Elizabeth, sensing something sinister, had declined. She believed Belle had been looking for someone to serve as the headless corpse in her escape plan. Ray Lamphere was ultimately convicted of arson but acquitted of murder. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison but died of tuberculosis just over a year later. On his deathbed, he allegedly confessed to helping Belle escape. According to his cellmate, Ray said that Belle had killed the children and an unknown woman, placed the bodies in the basement, and then had Ray start the fire while she escaped. He claimed to have driven her to the train station, where she took a train to Chicago with a large trunk that he believed contained money and valuables. The mystery of Belle Gunness became a national obsession. Books were written, songs were composed, and tourists flocked to La Porte to see the infamous farm. The property became known as Murder Farm, and locals reported seeing strange lights and hearing screams at night. Many claimed the land was cursed, haunted by the spirits of Belle's victims. Over the years, there were numerous alleged sightings of Belle. In 1931, a woman named Esther Carlson was arrested in Los Angeles for poisoning a man for his money. Before she could be tried, she died. But some who had known Belle swore that Esther was actually Belle Gunness. The body was exhumed for examination, but by then it was too decomposed to make a positive identification. The question of what drove Belle to kill has fascinated criminologists and psychologists for over a century. She was one of the first recognized female serial killers in America, challenging prevailing notions about women and violence. Some have suggested that her hard childhood in Norway shaped her, that the poverty and desperation she experienced, they created a ruthlessness that manifested in murder. Others point to the deaths of her children Caroline and Axel, suggesting that these early deaths, whether natural or not, may have desensitized her to killing. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Belle's crimes was how calculated they were. This wasn't a woman driven by passion or madness. She killed methodically, practically, as if murder were simply another farm chore to be completed. She understood people's weaknesses and exploited them ruthlessly. She created an entire persona, the lonely widow looking for love, that was perfectly designed to attract victims. She manipulated the insurance system, the legal system, and social expectations to get away with murder for years. Belle was also remarkably adaptive. When one scheme stopped working, she developed another. When questions arose, she had answers ready. When threats emerged, she eliminated them. She was always thinking several steps ahead, always planning for contingencies. Even her final escape, if that's indeed what happened, showed remarkable foresight and planning. The impact of Belle's crimes extended far beyond her immediate victims. Families across the Midwest were left wondering what had happened to their missing relatives. The Norwegian immigrant community, already facing discrimination and suspicion, found themselves under even more scrutiny. The insurance industry implemented new investigative procedures. The very idea of the Black Widow killer entered the American consciousness, a template that would be seen again and again in the years to come. In La Porte, the effects were particularly profound. The town's reputation was forever linked to Belle's crimes. Properties near the farm lost value. Parents warned their children to stay away from the site. For decades, locals reported strange occurrences. Unexplained lights, mysterious sounds, a feeling of being watched. Whether these were genuine paranormal experiences or simply the power of suggestion, they spoke to the deep psychological scar Belle had left on the community. The legal implications of the case were significant as, well, the investigation revealed serious flaws in how missing persons cases were handled, particularly when it came to immigrants and transients. It highlighted the ease with which someone could assume another's identity, forge documents, and collect insurance money. It showed how a seemingly respectable member of the community could hide terrible crimes behind a facade of normalcy. The case also raised uncomfortable questions about gender and crime. Belle had gotten away with her crimes for so long, partly because people couldn't believe a woman was capable of such violence. The idea of a female serial killer was so foreign to early 20th century sensibilities that warning signs were ignored or explained away. Belle understood this and used it to her advantage, playing the role of the helpless widow even as she was planning her next murder. The children in Belle's life present another tragic dimension to the story. Myrtle and Lucy, her daughters with Mads Sorensen, lived in that house of horrors, possibly aware that something was terribly wrong, but powerless to stop it. Did they know what their mother was doing? Did they see things they shouldn't have seen? The fact that they died in the fire, whether killed by Belle or Ray Lamphere, adds another layer of tragedy to an already horrific story. Philip Gunness, Belle's son with Peter, was just 5 years old when he died in the fire. He had lived his entire short life on that farm, surrounded by death and deception. One can only imagine what kind of psychological damage such an environment would have caused had he lived. The other Gunness children, Peter's daughters from his first marriage, were fortunate to have been sent away to live with relatives after their father's death, likely saving their lives. The physical evidence from the farm continued to surface. For years after the fire, farmers ploughing nearby fields would occasionally turn up bones or personal effects. Well diggers would find suspicious remains. Each discovery renewed interest in the case and prompted new searches. But Belle herself remained elusive. The farm itself was eventually sold and rebuilt, but subsequent owners reported strange happenings, doors opening on their own, cold spots in certain rooms, the sound of footsteps in empty hallways. Modern forensic scientists have reviewed the case, applying contemporary techniques to the available evidence. DNA analysis, had it been available at the time, might have identified many of the victims and confirmed whether the headless corpse was indeed Belle. Psychological profiling suggests that Belle exhibited traits consistent with psychopathy, lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, and an ability to maintain a false persona for extended periods. Some researchers have suggested that Belle may have had accomplices beyond Ray Lamphere. The sheer physical labor involved in killing and disposing of so many bodies would have been challenging for one person, even someone as strong as Belle. There were rumors of other farmhands who disappeared suddenly or left town under mysterious circumstances. But without Belle to interrogate, these theories remain speculation. The financial aspect of Belle's crimes is staggering when adjusted for inflation. She is estimated to have stolen at least $30,000 from her victims, equivalent to over $1 million today. But the true amount may have been much higher. She owned property, had bank accounts under various names, and may have had hidden caches of money that were never found. If she did escape, she would have had enough resources to start a new life. Anywhere in the world, the question of whether Belle escaped or died in the fire continues to divide researchers. Those who believe she died point to the dental bridge found in the ruins, arguing that Belle wouldn't have left such an identifying piece of evidence if she were trying to fake her death. But others note that the bridge could have been planted, and that a woman as calculating as Belle would have had an escape plan ready. If Belle did escape, where did she go? Some believe she returned to Norway, where she could blend in with the population and where American authorities would have had difficulty tracking her. Others think she went to the western United States, where a woman with money could easily establish a new identity. Still, others believe she never left the Midwest, that she simply moved to a large city like Chicago, where she could disappear into the crowd. The cultural impact of Belle's story has been significant. She has been the subject of numerous books, films, and television shows. Her story has been adapted into operas, plays, and even a musical. She has become a part of American folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of loneliness and greed. But in all these retellings, the real Belle remains elusive, her true motivations and ultimate fate unknown. For the families of the victims, the cultural fascination with Belle can be painful. Their loved ones have been reduced to footnotes in Belle's story, their lives overshadowed by their deaths. Many descendants have worked to preserve the memory of the victims, to ensure that they are remembered as more than just Belle's prey. They were fathers, brothers, sons, men who came to America seeking a better life and found only death. The story of Belle Gunness also reflects the darker side of the American dream. These immigrants came to America believing in the promise of opportunity and prosperity. They worked hard, saved their money, and dreamed of finding love and building families. Belle exploited these dreams, using them as bait to lure her victims to their deaths. In a perverse way, she embodied the ruthless capitalism of the Gilded Age, treating human lives as commodities to be exploited for profit. The investigation techniques used in the Belle Gunness case were groundbreaking for their time. It was one of the first cases where investigators systematically excavated a crime scene, carefully documenting the location and condition of each body. The use of dental records to identify remains was still relatively new. The case helped establish protocols for handling mass burial sites that are still used today. Law enforcement learned valuable lessons from their failures in the Gunness case. The fact that Belle was able to kill for so long without detection revealed serious gaps in communication between different jurisdictions. There was no centralized system for tracking missing persons, no way to connect disappearances across state lines. The case led to improvements in record-keeping and information sharing that would eventually evolve into modern databases and investigative techniques. The role of the media in the Belle Gunness case was significant and controversial. Newspapers sensationalized the story, often printing rumors and speculation as fact. They published graphic descriptions of the crimes and turned Belle into a celebrity of sorts. This media coverage both helped and hindered the investigation. It brought forward witnesses and generated leads, but it also created a circus atmosphere that made serious investigation difficult. The legal proceedings following the discovery of the bodies were complex and unprecedented. There were questions about inheritance, insurance claims, and property rights. Some of Belle's victims had left estates that now had no clear heirs. Insurance companies that had paid out policies to Belle tried to recover their money. The farm itself became tied up in legal battles that lasted for years. The psychological impact on the Laporte community was profound and long-lasting. Children who had gone to school with Belle's daughters were traumatized by the revelation that their classmates had been living with a serial killer. Neighbors who had socialized with Belle, who had eaten her cooking and admired her garden, were forced to confront the fact that they had been completely deceived. Trust, once broken on such a scale, was difficult to rebuild. The Belle Gunness case also had implications for the treatment of mental illness and personality disorders. While Belle was never formally diagnosed, her behavior suggests a severe personality disorder, possibly psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder. The case highlighted the need for better understanding and identification of these conditions, though it would be decades before significant progress was made in this area. The forensic evidence from the Gunness farm provided valuable data for early forensic scientists. The various states of decomposition of the bodies helped establish timelines for decay in different soil conditions. The patterns of dismemberment provided insights into the methods and tools used. This information contributed to the developing field of forensic anthropology. Religious leaders struggled to make sense of Belle's crimes within a theological framework. How could a woman who attended church regularly, who sang hymns with apparent devotion, commit such heinous acts? Some saw her as evidence of pure evil in the world, while others argued that she was mentally ill and not fully responsible for her actions. The debate reflected larger questions about the nature of evil and free will that continue to this day. The economic impact of Belle's crimes extended beyond the immediate loss of life and property. The fear generated by her crimes affected property values throughout the region. Tourism, initially drawn by morbid curiosity, eventually became a significant source of income for Laporte, though many residents remained ambivalent about profiting from tragedy. The case also led to changes in banking and financial practices, particularly regarding the verification of identity and the transfer of large sums of money. The international dimensions of the case were significant. Many of Belle's victims were Norwegian immigrants, and the case received extensive coverage in Norwegian newspapers. The Norwegian government became involved, helping to identify victims and notify families. The case strained relations between immigrant communities and established Americans, reinforcing stereotypes and prejudices on both sides. As the years passed, the Belle Gunness case became a touchstone for discussions about female violence and criminality. She challenged the Victorian ideal of women as naturally nurturing and moral. Feminist scholars have examined her case as an extreme example of a woman operating outside social norms, using the very stereotypes that constrained women to her advantage. This analysis, while not excusing her crimes, provides insight into the gender dynamics of the early 20th century. The technological limitations of the era played a crucial role in Belle's ability to evade capture for so long. Without fingerprint databases, DNA analysis, or modern communication systems, it was remarkably easy for someone to disappear and assume a new identity. Belle understood these limitations and exploited them expertly. Her case highlighted the need for better identification and tracking systems, needs that would eventually be met through technological advancement. The question of Belle's mental state remains a subject of debate among criminologists and psychologists. Was she a cold, calculating psychopath who felt no remorse for her actions? Or was she driven by trauma, perhaps from her impoverished childhood or the loss of her children? Some have suggested that she may have suffered from a delusional disorder, genuinely believing that her actions were justified. Without the ability to examine her, these questions remain unanswered. The legacy of Belle Gunness in popular culture is complex and often troubling. She has been both demonized and disturbingly romanticized. Some portrayals present her as a feminist anti-hero, a woman who refused to be constrained by societal expectations. This interpretation is deeply problematic, as it minimizes the horror of her crimes and the suffering of her victims. More thoughtful examinations recognize her as a complex figure who can be understood without being excused. The physical remnants of Belle's crimes have largely disappeared. The farm has been rebuilt, the graves have been emptied, and most of the evidence has been lost or destroyed. But the psychological scars remain. Descendants of victims still struggle with the knowledge of how their ancestors died. The town of Laporte still grapples with its dark history. The fascination with Belle Gunness continues, a reminder of humanity's capacity for both deception and evil. In recent years, there have been efforts to memorialize the victims of Belle Gunness. A small plaque has been placed near the site of the farm, listing the names of known victims. Genealogists have worked to trace the families of victims, providing closure to descendants who may not have known what happened to their ancestors. These efforts represent an attempt to shift focus from Belle to those whose lives she cut short. The investigation techniques pioneered during the Belle Gunness case laid the groundwork for modern criminal investigation. The systematic excavation of the farm, the use of dental records for identification, and the coordination between multiple jurisdictions all represented advances in law enforcement. The case is still studied in criminal justice programs as an example of both investigative success and failure. The question of accomplices continues to intrigue researchers. While Ray Lamphere was the only person convicted in connection with the crimes, many believe that Belle must have had other helpers over the years. The physical demands of her crimes, moving bodies, digging graves, maintaining the facade of normalcy, suggest that she may have had a network of assistants, willing or unwilling. Some researchers have identified farmhands and local residents who disappeared around the same time as Belle, suggesting they may have known too much. The financial forensics of the case reveal a sophisticated understanding of banking and insurance systems. Belle maintained multiple accounts under different names, moved money through various channels, and timed her insurance claims carefully to avoid suspicion. This level of financial sophistication was unusual for a woman of her background and era, suggesting either remarkable self-education or assistance from someone with expertise in these areas. The environmental impact of Belle's crimes is rarely discussed but significant. The contamination of soil and groundwater from decomposing bodies, the potential health risks to subsequent residents of the property, and the ecological disruption caused by the extensive excavation all represent lasting consequences of her actions. Modern environmental regulations would require extensive remediation of such a site, but in 1908, these concerns were not understood or addressed. As we approach the final revelations of this dark tale, it's important to consider what the Belle Gunness case teaches us about human nature and society. Her ability to deceive so many for so long reveals uncomfortable truths about our willingness to see what we want to see, to ignore warning signs when they conflict with our assumptions. The lonely men who came to her farm wanted so desperately to believe in the possibility of love and companionship that they ignored the danger signs. The community wanted so badly to believe in the respectability of their neighbor that they dismissed evidence of her crimes. The timing of Belle's crimes during the massive wave of immigration to America in the early 1900s was not coincidental. She understood that immigrants, particularly those without strong community ties, were vulnerable. They were less likely to be missed, less likely to have their disappearances investigated. She exploited the very marginalization that many immigrants faced, turning their isolation into her opportunity. This aspect of her crimes speaks to larger issues of social justice and the protection of vulnerable populations that remain relevant today. The role of gender expectations in Belle's crimes cannot be overstated. She used society's assumptions about women, that they were weak, nurturing, incapable of violence, as a shield. When Peter Gunness died from a blow to the head, the idea that Belle could have wielded the weapon seemed impossible to many. When men disappeared from her farm, authorities assumed they had simply moved on, not that they had been murdered by a woman. Belle understood these biases and used them strategically, maintaining a facade of feminine respectability even as she committed the most unfeminine crimes imaginable. The children who survived their time with Belle carry a unique burden. Peter Gunness's daughters, who were sent away after their father's death, lived with the knowledge that their stepmother was a serial killer who might have murdered their father. Neighbors' children who had played with Myrtle and Lucy were left to wonder what their friends had known, what they had seen. These secondary victims of Belle's crimes often suffered in silence, their trauma unrecognized and untreated in an era that had little understanding of psychological damage. The insurance industry's response to the Belle Gunness case was swift and significant. New investigative procedures were implemented, including more thorough verification of deaths and stricter requirements for beneficiary designations. The case exposed how easily the system could be manipulated by someone with enough knowledge and audacity. The reforms implemented in response to Belle's crimes helped shape modern insurance investigation practices. The archaeological techniques developed during the excavation of the Gunness farm advanced the field of forensic archaeology. The careful mapping of burial sites, the documentation of soil layers, and the preservation of evidence established protocols that would be refined and used in future criminal investigations. The case demonstrated the importance of treating crime scenes as archaeological sites, with each layer and artifact potentially holding crucial information. The international nature of Belle's victim pool highlighted the need for better cooperation between American and European authorities. Many of the victims had families in Norway who were left without answers for years. The case led to improved channels of communication between international law enforcement agencies and helped establish protocols for handling crimes involving foreign nationals that are still in use today. As the investigation progressed and the full scope of Belle's crimes became clear, it raised disturbing questions about how many other killers might be operating undetected. If Belle could kill dozens of people over nearly 2 decades without detection, how many others were doing the same? This realization led to increased attention to missing persons cases and pattern recognition in law enforcement, though it would be decades before systems were in place to effectively track and identify serial offenders. The economic model of Belle's crimes, killing for profit, represented a particularly cold form of serial murder. Unlike killers driven by psychological compulsion or sexual gratification, Belle appeared to be motivated primarily by money. This made her crimes seem even more calculating and inhuman to many observers. The idea that someone could treat murder as a business transaction challenged fundamental assumptions about human morality and the limits of greed. The legal precedent set during the prosecution of Ray Lamphere and the subsequent civil cases had lasting impacts on American jurisprudence. Questions about evidence, witness testimony, and the rights of the accused in sensational cases were all addressed during these proceedings. The case also highlighted the challenges of prosecuting crimes where the primary perpetrator was missing and presumed dead, establishing precedents for how such cases should be handled. The Belle Gunness case also influenced the development of criminal profiling. Early attempts to understand Belle's psychology and predict her behavior if she had survived laid the groundwork for later profiling techniques. The case demonstrated that serial killers could be women, could be motivated by profit rather than psychological compulsion, and could maintain normal facades for extended periods. These insights broadened the understanding of serial crime and helped investigators recognize patterns that might previously have been overlooked. Now, as we reach the emotional crescendo of this dark saga, we must confront the most haunting aspect of Belle's story: the fate of her own children. Myrtle, Lucy, and Philip died in that fire, their young lives cut short in the most horrific way imaginable. For years, people assumed they were victims of Ray Lamphere's revenge. But as more evidence emerged about Belle's crimes, a far more chilling possibility arose. Consider the timeline. Belle knew the walls were closing in. Isel Helgelian was coming to look for his brother. George Anderson had fled and would surely talk. Ray Lamphere was making drunken threats in town. Belle had successfully faked deaths before, collected insurance money, and disappeared. She had killed children before, possibly her own Caroline and Axel, certainly Jenny Olsen. Would a woman who had murdered dozens of adults hesitate to kill her own children if it meant securing her escape? The evidence suggests a methodical plan. Belle had increased her life insurance. She had made a will. She had publicly expressed fear for her life. She had hired Joe Maxson to stay in the house but placed him far from where the family slept. She had acquired a victim to serve as her body double, that unknown woman whose headless corpse was found in the basement. Everything points to a carefully orchestrated deception, one final grand fraud to cap a lifetime of murder and deceit. But the children, her own flesh and blood. How could any mother, no matter how evil, murder her own babies? This is where the true horror of Belle Gunness reveals itself. She wasn't a mother in any meaningful sense of the word. She was a predator who happened to have offspring. Myrtle, Lucy and Philip were simply loose ends to be tied up, potential witnesses to be silenced, insurance policies to be cashed. The forensic evidence supports this nightmarish conclusion. The children's bodies were found in the basement, with the headless woman, arranged as if they had all died together. But the fire patterns suggested the blaze started after they were already dead. They showed no signs of smoke inhalation, no evidence of trying to escape. They had been poisoned, investigators believed, given something to make them sleep forever before the fire was set. It was Belle's final signature, murder disguised as tragedy, profit dressed up as loss. Ray Lamphere, dying of tuberculosis in prison, swore that Belle had killed the children herself. He claimed she had given them poison, telling them it was medicine, watching as they slipped away. Then she had arranged their bodies in the basement, placed the murdered woman beside them, removed the woman's head to prevent identification, and planted her own dental bridge as false evidence of her death. Only then had she summoned Ray to set the fire while she made her escape. This revelation forces us to reconsider everything about Belle's story. Every moment of apparent maternal care, every gesture of affection toward her children was a performance. She had raised them like livestock, maintaining them until they no longer served her purpose. When the time came to disappear, she eliminated them as coldly as she had eliminated all her other victims. They were not her children in her eyes. They were props in her elaborate theater of deception. The people of Laporte, when they learned this truth, were shattered. They had seen Belle with her children at church, at school events, in town. The children had seemed happy, well cared for. Lucy had been particularly bright, excelling in her studies. Myrtle had been popular with her classmates. Little Philip had been a cheerful boy who loved to play with the farm animals. How could they reconcile these memories with the monster Belle had proven to be? The answer is that they couldn't. The cognitive dissonance was too great. Some people simply refused to believe Belle had killed her own children, insisting that Ray Lamphere must have done it, or that it had been a tragic accident. Others were forced to confront the fact that evil could wear the mask of normalcy so completely that it was indistinguishable from genuine humanity. The children's teachers, friends, and neighbors were left to wonder what signs they had missed, what they could have done differently. But perhaps the most tragic aspect is that the children themselves probably never suspected their mother was a killer. They had grown up in that house of horrors, surrounded by death and deception, but to them it was simply home. They had seen men come to the farm and disappear, but their mother always had explanations. They had noticed strange smells, heard unexplained noises, but children adapt to their circumstances. What seems abnormal to outsiders becomes routine to those who know nothing else. On that last night, as Belle prepared their final meal, did she show any emotion? Did her hands tremble as she added the poison to their food? Or was she as calm and methodical as always, viewing their deaths as simply another necessary task? We'll never know, but Ray Lamphere claimed she had been cold as winter ground when she told him what she had done. She had shown no more emotion than if she had been discussing the slaughter of chickens. The deaths of Myrtle, Lucy, and Philip represent the ultimate betrayal. A mother murdering her own children, not in a moment of madness or desperation, but as part of a calculated plan. They were sacrificed on the altar of Belle's greed and self-preservation. Their young lives were ended not by a stranger, not by an enemy, but by the one person who should have protected them above all others.